Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margo Pearce again. I am a settler person. I'm an uninvited guest here, currently on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm also a research and evaluation specialist, relatively new to the position with Indigenous cultural safety at Fraser Health, and I'm delighted to be here and grateful for the opportunity to moderate this session. I'd like to let you know that there are concurrent breakout sessions throughout the day and tomorrow. And of course, you can find the details, including the Zoom links, in your conference schedule. Please, again, be mindful. You just heard the announcement. This presentation is being recorded. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you could send it to me via private message in the chat, and I could bring it to the speaker's attention. I'll just remind you also that we have a self-care guide with resources and tips, and the guide includes suggestions about how you can stay comfortable and safe throughout these sessions, and I highly recommend you take some breaks for yourself. And if you need help, you can contact people who are the Fraser Center staff, and you'll see their logo in their Zoom background. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to the presenter in this session, Dr. Keith Thor Carlson, who is speaking about the colonization of Coast Salish families and the rise of intercommunity conflicts. Keith is a very accomplished person. He is a Canada Research Chair on Indigenous and Community Engaged History at the University of the Fraser Valley. He's also the director of the relatively new Peace and Reconciliation Center. And I don't want to take up any more of your time, Keith, so I will pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Thank you, Margo. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this. And thank you for sticking around. It's been a long afternoon of just really rich information that I've been taking in. So I'm sure people are getting exhausted, and I appreciate you being here still. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And there we go. And yeah, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here with you and I'll walk you through this presentation. So I should, oops, there we go. I should clarify right off the bat, just in case anybody was confused, that I'm not a scientist. I'm not trained in the medical fields. I'm a historian, an ethnohistorian, so formerly trained in history and anthropology. And I've been working with the Stalo communities now since 1992, when I was employed there as a research coordinator and historian, and have since recently relocated back to the Fraser Valley from the University of Saskatchewan. I want to acknowledge these three women, Myra Sam, Marge Kelly, and Tilly Gutierrez, who are the three who inspired this project that I'll be talking to you about today. This is work that emerged simply over a cup of tea at one point at Myra's house, where I was popping in to visit her. It wasn't part of a research project or anything. I was just saying hi. I was in town at the time. I lived in Saskatoon and was making my trips out to the Fraser Valley. And they were talking about the difficulty that some of the Stalo and wider Coast Salish communities were having in terms of cooperating around resource management, forestry, fisheries, those issues in particular. And they pointed out, Myra and Marge, as they were talking, that it seemed that when it came to topics and issues and programs that were regarded more as women's topics, I put that in quote, such as child and family services, that there was a greater opportunity, a greater willingness, and a greater propensity towards success in collaborating across and between First Nations groups and tribal community boundaries. Tilly Gutierrez was an elder who I'd spoken to earlier. By that time, she had passed away. But this conversation got me thinking a lot about earlier conversations I had with Tilly around the role that women played in traditional society. And I began to hypothesize with Marge and Myra around sort of what could be the origins of this, and could there be a research project? This drew us back to the sort of classic ethnographic studies, which talk about the key thing that differentiates the Coast Salish, of whom the Stalo, the Musqueam, the Katzie, the Chilhoyak, the Cowichan, and then the groups in Puget Sound are all a part of. The key thing that differentiates them from groups farther north on the coast is that in their society, you have bilateral descent patterns. You have systems where people can inherit wealth and property and names and songs through either their mother or their father's line. And that in fact, people had, rather than it being sort of a ranked system, this was classically a class-based system in the past in this area. And that, according to the ethnographic sources and analysis, is because within every tribal territory, and all of the Coast Salish tribes tend to be anchored around watersheds, sub-watersheds of the Fraser River, like the Pitt River, the Chilliwack River, the Harrison River, the Coquihalla River, and then over on the Vancouver Island, and Nanaimo, the Cowichan, and so on. That each of those tribal groups has certain food resources that are available only at particular times of the year, and only in abundance at particular times of the year and in certain annual cycles. So, for example, fish coming back on a 4-year cycles returning to the rivers. And that meant that anyone living in one particular ecological niche for their area was dependent upon accessing the resources, the food resources, the wealth that existed in other people's tribal territories that were available at slightly different times of the year on different annual or seasonal cycles, and that were their different ecological niches. So some real obvious ones would be that if you were from Hope, Yale, or Spuzzum, you would have no access to mollusks, clams, crabs, and saltwater fish. And if you wanted access to those, if you felt a desire for those, you would have to somehow access resources that existed in Musqueam or Tawasin territory. Likewise, if you were from the Chilhoyak territory, you would have wonderful access to mountains that had mountain goats, where mountain goat wool could be procured, and other mountain resources like mountain cranberries. But you didn't necessarily have access to wapatos and cranberry bogs, which were very plentiful in Matsqui territory, for example, or down in Katzie territory. And so all of these communities were constantly working out systems to access the resources in their neighbors' community. The role of elite males in this system, the Siam, the men who were the heads of certain families and tended to live in patrilocal residence patterns where their fathers, with members of that tribal community. Their job, their position, their perspective was largely one about tribal exclusivity. Their job was to protect the resources in their territory, all the while knowing that they had to grant access, to facilitate access to others from outside their territory in order for them to access resources from another territory. Women, elite women in this system, were the diplomats. So marriages were arranged between elite families where elite women would typically go to relocate and live in the families, the tribal territories of their husbands in polyamorous, polygamous marriages, where a husband would live in his village, tribal community with 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 9, 12 wives in some cases, historically, we have documented. And each one of those women was a facilitator, a diplomat who brought with them access, privileges, and rights to territories beyond their husband's territory. And the children of those relationships, who would be being co-raised by mothers from different tribal communities, would all have dual citizenship at a minimum in both the location of their mother and the location of their father. And so these ecological niches with these seasonal variabilities and seasonal abundance facilitate a network of intertribal cooperation and sharing that was built upon a perspective that was largely regarded in the past as being the woman's perspective, the perspective on tribal inclusivity, territorial inclusivity, whereas the men's perspective was largely tribal exclusivity. And both of those operated in balance to one another, in a delicate balance. When the missionaries arrived, when the Canadian government arrived, we're fairly familiar with the well-documented story about the creation of these oppressive and exploitative and abusive residential schools, how fishing rights were taken away, how Indigenous people were marginalized and put on small marginal reserves so they could not access and control the resources in their territory, how the right to access and sell fish was eliminated in the 19th century, the banning of the potlatch, which basically ended the ability of people to effectively govern intertribal governance all broke down because, sorry, here we are, because the system of communal life that had been so central to Coast Salish lives for multiple generations, centuries going back in time, had been massively disrupted. But it's those processes that impacted the family that have received far less attention than the impacts to land and resources outside of the reserve. And those systems of governance that have created the idea of band membership lists, where a person is born into a community and has a membership in only one community per time. That's all that Department of Indian Affairs would recognize up to this day. And so when wives relocated to live at their husbands, or more recently when husbands relocated to live in their wives' community, they had to give up their membership in their home birthplace to acquire the membership in the other location. This wasn't the case in the past. And so what we're seeing is a breakdown of the systems and structures that provided a perspective, a woman's perspective, a feminine perspective, a female perspective on space and territoriality that was anchored in very firm concepts of women's positions within families and this diplomatic role. So this potlatch in particular, the banning of the potlatch, which we see here, the very earliest Western depiction of a potlatch at Fort Hope in 1859, was at the core of this system. People would get married, the rights would be passed down, again, through mother or father's line, to children on either side of that relationship, and that these would be made publicly known through massive potlatch ceremonies. So fishing rights would be inherited, and there was a gender division of labor on how that worked, so that people from one area that did not have access to, say, the wind drying, spectacular wind drying opportunities of the Fraser Canyon could exchange access to that resource for access to wapatos, cranberries, clams, oysters down near the ocean. Our hypothesis was that we should be able to see this in some ways reflected not only in a social history, a social study, a social history study of family change over time, which hadn't been done up to this point, but also potentially in narratives, the Shwokwiem narratives of the Stalo Coast Salish people that link and explain their connection to the land. And in the Coast Salish world, in the Stalo world, the story of Chels, or the sibling Chels in plural, is often talked about, the children of red-headed woodpecker and black bear who were born at the head of Harrison Lake. And then from there, begin a journey to take a formerly chaotic world and turn it into a more predictable and peaceful world that people would recognize today, and how their early efforts at that were not successful. So they traveled up the river into the sun, they traveled through the sun and through the sky back into the sunrise, or sort of the sunset, and then traveled back up the Fraser River again, and then created each of the tribal territories, the created founders for each of the tribal territories along the lower Fraser River and also on the adjacent shores of Vancouver Island. These stories remain in circulation, and they tend to emphasize the male figures who were the original tribal founders of these communities. In this massive database that we've created that has been recording and preserving narratives that have been recorded either in audio form or in paper form, dating back to the 1870s, what we see is that other stories that emphasize intertribal cooperation, stories that do not have a particular geographical anchor or location, what we refer to as the in-between stories, have faded, have become less prominent, and some have actually seemed to have disappeared from the lexicon as circulating today. And likewise, the stories of interspecies, that is animal, interspecies, and intertribal cooperation, which were so prominent in incredibly long and detailed epic narratives recorded in the 19th century, such as the story of Beaver's travels to acquire fire, where he travels from somewhere in the Central Valley, probably Matsqui, although it's not spelled out, because Matsqui has the beaver as their ancestor spirit, out to the coast, acquires fire, goes through arduous journeys back into the Central Valley, needs to travel back up into the Fraser Canyon and then over to Harrison Lake, where special knowledge is acquired that enables him to distribute fire to all the Stala people, so that people no longer live in cold, no longer live in darkness, and are able to cook food. This story is similar to the salmon origin story recorded in 1902, where again, beaver travels a great distance so that there can be salmon in each of the Stalo communities. Or the other beaver story, which is recorded, another version of that story, which talks about beaver traveling off to a distant site in the ocean where he acquires a clamshell, comes back and works with his friend, the eagle, to acquire fire from way up in the interior and bring it back down and spread it throughout the area, as well as the knowledge of how to make fire for the Stalo people. So what these stories indicate is over time, women characters have dropped from these stories or become less prominent. They're no longer had proper noun names, and the stories of intertribal and interspecies cooperation has diminished. And so what we're suggesting here is that the attacks on family, which received far less attention, have had implications not only on the health of families, that is to say, the relationships between couples, spouses, and their children in terms of peaceful and non-peaceful relationships and violence and non-violence, but also more broadly and expansively, those relationships between tribal communities all throughout the Coast Salish world. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now so that we have time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that presentation. I was enraptured. I'm sure many of us were. I'm just looking in the chat to see if there are any questions coming up. I'll just begin, Keith, perhaps, and maybe we'll see some questions coming through. You were speaking a little bit about the spiritual connection to land and how that's connected to family and the interconnections between all living things and family and that. It really made me think a lot about the beginning of our symposium today about what Len was talking about. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit further about that, if you could sort of unpack those ideas a little bit more in what you've learned.
Sure, absolutely. The way elders have explained it to me is that literally the Stalo Constitution, the Coast Salish Constitution, is written on the landscape. It was that process of chachels, the transformers, traveling throughout the Coast Salish world, Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland and the Fraser Valley, that created a world that turned people into mountains, turned certain people into trees, certain people into certain animal species, and created the tribal founders in various locations, so that all of the ancestors who are connected to people today through ancestral connections, blood ties, and spiritual connections, that extends to the plants, the animals, the mountains, and the waterways of the Stalo territory. And so these narratives that describe these connections that actually are the origin stories and the transformer stories were not merely about at that mountain is, Chlithlake, the woman, the mother mountain that was transformed. They actually talk about how to create this process, the transformers were drawing power from one location, going to another and testing that power, encountering people to assist them and aid them in their journeys, and then to create some massive transformative action, which would then set in motion the next transformative action. And what my hypothesis is, based on the research, what my findings are essentially here, working with elders on this project, is that the process of creating nuclear family homes, the idea that courtly love marriages, people should fall in love, choose their own spouse, get married in a monogamous relationship with a patriarchal male head of a household that was brought in and introduced in the late 19th century. And then the creation of homes, nuclear family homes, where there are individualized spaces, doors that can be closed, bedrooms that can be locked off. To people who formerly lived in giant open longhouses, where literally the ability to abuse someone physically, sexually was impossible without it being seen in a great big open longhouse, where women were observing things all the time, where co-wives were co-raising children in these relationships. That all of that was massively disrupted by a very specific definition, a Western definition of family, and a very specific role for women within that family. And simultaneously, as the formal politics of settler colonialism are unfolding, what we have are Indigenous men who are being put into positions of authority authorized by the government, that is to say, a chief who has responsibility for a particular reserve, right? And then clashes for the few scattered remaining resources, whether they're fish, water, plants, animals, medicines that exist off of that tiny reserve base. And so this whole system has pitted families together while it's stripped away the mechanisms in the past that women played a central role in, like more than a central role, that was their role, was to facilitate cooperation and sharing between communities. So that story has not been told or understood, and instead we have government agents' narratives and people, really well-meaning people working in social welfare and the medical fields and others who see things that have been pathologized within Indigenous communities, but not understanding the settler colonial origins and the trajectory of that expression of power on those communities, for how it disrupted and marginalized the role of women within those communities.
I see there's a hand raised from Kathleen. Would you like to ask your question?
I find it really fascinating. I spent some time out at Seabird Island. I didn't see it there, but I'm sure you know of Seabird Island. And so I was always fascinated by just their language and everything, as someone from the West Coast coming in. And, you know, we're very patriarchal out where I'm from, and they're very matriarchal. And, you know, and so that was actually very new to me. But one of the things I was curious about was, number one, was their way of getting access after the colonialistic approach, because before there was such negotiation between the different tribes and the different people there to do things and to gain access to, because food security became an issue right off the bat, and with colonialism, because before they were able to go and negotiate and then have access to, whereas they weren't allowed to leave their reservations and go and get what they needed. Like everything just began to just completely implode on themselves, right? And so, you know, everything else coming together. So the other thing was the language, because I wanted to know, like, if you spoke with a linguist or anything about how their language can be found in maybe some of the other tribes, because they had to travel and have access to certain things. Is there anything that you know, linguistically that
Yeah, I'm not a linguist, but I've worked a lot with linguists and with knowledge keepers who were still, today there's unfortunately only one woman in the upper Stalo area who still carries the language that she was born speaking as her first language. When I started in the early 1990s, there were still a couple of dozen. They passed away now. But absolutely, what we see is these women were diplomats and were linguists. They would bring language and train their children to be bilingual if they were from outside of tribal, like outside of a language family area, whether it's a dialect or a full language family. And then different co-wives are raising children together in situations where those children are being exposed to the narratives and the stories of each of their co-parent, right? Like their mothers, who are their, you know, the biological mother of their half brothers through this complex system that the Coast Salish had in place. So absolutely, and the potlatch. Was so central. It was at the potlatch that marriages were arranged and announced, that rights were transferred and inherited. And when the government bans the potlatch in 1884, what it sets in motion is massive conflicts over resource sites. So the few land and resources that Stalo people were still able to access and control and regulate to some degree, even if it was only seasonally in terms of going out to summer fish camps or mountain sites for certain activities. Suddenly, the ability of an elder to say, I am transferring this property right with this name down to my nephew so-and-so, or to my niece so-and-so, or my grandson so-and-so, When you ban the potlatch, that breaks down. And suddenly what you have are people saying, well, Grandpa sort of implied to me that I was going to inherit that site. Well, no, 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 no. You know, it was so-and-so. He thinks that it's his. And now those relatives, because he's married someone and a generation goes by, and now suddenly families are literally clashing, sometimes physically clashing at those resource sites because their system of regulating and managing those has been criminalized. And so their actions, not only is it criminal, you know, by the Canadian standards to fish at certain times in certain places, but their system of governance that would have regulated how they fished and hunted and gathered in places has been criminalized as well. So thank you, Kathleen. That was an excellent question.
Yes, thank you so much. I've gotten a question from someone asking if you looked through old ship logs from the first Europeans coming in via the sea and how they described what they saw.
Yeah, I have actually. I know it's one of those quirky things historians get a thrill out of. So, yep, I've done that. And in fact, my colleague and I at UVic, John Lutz, are slowly making our way to a book called The Salish Sea in 1792, which is to publish those journals in extract form alongside oral histories describing the same event as these two communities come together for the first time. And of course, what Captain George Vancouver and his crew and what the Spanish ships that were accompanying him at the exact same time saw in June and July of 1792, it was a world that had been absolutely turned upside down from the smallpox epidemic that had occurred 10 years earlier. That epidemic in 1782 spread all the way to the Fraser Valley, Vancouver, the Fraser Valley, from a Spanish garrison in Mexico City, where it had been introduced by a Spanish soldier who had brought it over from Spain. And it spread through intertribal trade networks and family networks, all the way up through the Columbia River system and then into this part of the world. And so a massive depopulation.
Yeah, I'm starting in a few minutes. What can I do for you?
A massive depopulation that occurs, which estimates the best we can get at are between 60 and 90% of the population are killed within 25 days of that disease being introduced. And the people who are dying and the survivors who are in massive trauma, right? We're talking about a society that has been suffering trauma, right? From 1782 at least forward, externally induced trauma. Those communities are unclear where that disease came from, what its origins were. And so many communities start pointing fingers saying it was such and such, it was our traditional enemies over there who must be to blame for all of this death that occurred. And so what we see is a massive increase in intertribal conflicts and raids and fighting in that late 18th, early 19th century as the older system is reestablished by survivors who are consolidating in small centers that are the most defensive ones, where they have that food security and physical security, and then re-expanding and reestablishing their tribal communities back on the landscape again. And so that process, that whole time period was a chaotic one, and people turned, it's very, very clear, people turned to these origin and transformer stories for inspiration and guidance. And this is one area where, again, my research differs from that of some earlier people working in ethnohistory who said, well, they had no precedent for smallpox, so therefore they didn't know how to use it, and it would have discredited their traditional healers. I don't actually believe that. The people who survived, the survivors of that epidemic, would have invested great value in their traditional healers because they survived. So it would have worked. It would have cut both ways. And obviously the people who did survive are coming out of that and looking around to say, what are the lessons from the past that we need to draw on and emphasize. And so it's those stories of the Great Flood. It's the stories of the massive volcanic eruptions from much earlier epochs that teach them, that give them the guidance on how to reconsolidate their communities in the wake of the epidemics.
So much to learn there, and so many, yeah, and I'm just seeing a lot of comments coming in and appreciation. And there's a question here saying, thank you, Dr. Carlson, for your presentation. A question: how do you navigate the intricacies of working with Indigenous peoples and at the same time conforming to Western-centric university visions of academic research excellence?
Right. What a great question. And of course, some of the previous presentations today spoke directly to that that question as well, and provided some really great answers and insights on how to do that. Maintaining communication and trust is number one, and getting to a point where there is sufficient trust that you could actually disagree, right? You don't have to agree on everything. You can say, well, in this project we're working on, we want to say that, in fact, maybe myself and some of the Stala people I'm collaborating with agree on an interpretation, but some might have a different perspective. And so we need to find the ways to communicate that and provide their voice and their perspective, amplification in there as well. Typically that doesn't happen, but you know, a new researcher working in a community for the first time will have to build the trust. And once you're in, you have to continually try to rebuild that trust. And knowing too that every community also has its fissures and its fractions within it. And so if you work closely with one segment of that community, more closely than another, you will also get associated with the segment that you're working with, which could cause other people to not want to work with you by association with the people that you're working with. So there isn't a one size fits all for this, and inevitably the process of community engaged scholarship is fraught with problems, right? It's one that's you're constantly having to work through and reestablish and build trust and then move forward. I think the thing that is very useful though is to not think of engaging on a project with a community so much as when you have a project, ideally initiated from the community rather than yourself, that you see that as the first in a sequence of projects within a program of research, so that in fact with each project that's done, greater trust is being built and greater collaboration, and a greater sort of sharing, a co-creating of knowledge, a co-communicating of knowledge, and a co-translation of that knowledge into forums that range from the academic to outputs that are very community facing in their design.
Well said. There was also a couple of comments here, really interesting, I think, from Timothy, who's talking about how I think he's seeing some overlap between what you're have been researching and what is happening, or what he knows about what's happening in the interior with nations in the interior, specifically the Shwalmuk, and I'm not going to pronounce the second nation correctly. Sorry about that. But I was just wondering if you want to speak a little bit more about that.
Well, perhaps that's about the idea of bilateral descent, that you can inherit wealth and property and titles and songs and things through either the mother or the father. Yeah, that's much more common in the interior plateau. It's on the coast, as you go farther north on the coast, that things tend to be, there's a different system. It's not better or worse, it's just different. But a lot of people will lump the entire Northwest Coast cultures together. And because so much attention has been focused in terms of the anthropological scholarship on the Kwakiwakwa communities and the Haida communities, those systems tend to be sort of assumed to apply in the Coast Salish world. And that's not the case. They're different, yeah. But definitely the Secwepemc and other interior communities are different, and in fact, in many ways more similar to the Coast Salish. Well, and it explains also that the language family, the interior Coast Salish language family connections, because of those connections across the mountain ranges back and forth and the influences.
There's also a question here about the historical account of smallpox in the Fraser Valley and in Vancouver, and originating from Mexico City, or perhaps and Central America, with claims that smallpox was a deliberate colonial attack using biological warfare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been some recent publications that have suggested, non-peer-reviewed works that have suggested that all of the smallpox epidemics that hit this region, in particular the 1862 epidemic. So I spoke about one, the early epidemic of 1782, there were in fact 3 other epidemics, major epidemics that swept through the Coast Salish world, and then a series of smaller isolated outbreaks of smallpox that occurred right up and into the first quarter of the 20th century. Those are great questions. My colleague and I have actually just got a large Shirk Insight grant to study the history of smallpox on the Northwest Coast, just because that question is so intriguing. What are the origins? What are the oral histories? What does the evidence suggest? And so we're beginning to do that research. One of the things that we have already determined, though, is that in the Chilcotin area, I mean, it's very clear that there was an intentional release of smallpox in that part of the world. In other parts of the colonial world in British Columbia, there were actually great efforts by certain missionaries and government agents to vaccinate and inoculate people against smallpox. And smallpox is something that is very, very difficult to control. It spread into this area as part of continent-wide pandemics. That 1782 epidemic that reached here was part of the Great Pox Americana of 1780, which literally spread 2 years earlier from, as I said, from Mexico City up and throughout the entire continental United States and much of Canada. But what we have identified, though, already in our research on that grant, because we're only in the first phases of a 5-year grant, is that there were at least a dozen cases that we've been able to document where Europeans threatened to release biological warfare. They threatened to release smallpox. This is in addition to the one documented case where they did release smallpox in the Chilcotin Plateau. And that this threat of releasing smallpox, as anybody who studies race relations in the United States knows, the Ku Klux Klan doesn't need to lynch someone every week, every month, every year. They can burn a cross every year, and that's enough to intimidate. And it's that threat of releasing violence that is incredibly powerful. And what we've seen in our research so far preliminarily is that there were numerous attempts by settlers, by fur traders and others, where they threatened to release smallpox. They didn't actually have the ability to release smallpox in the cases that we've documented, but they threatened to. And the Indigenous people didn't know that it was actually a bluff threat in most of those cases. And so, of course, when the disease did hit later, spread through tribal trade networks, or as in the case in the Chilcotin area, where that disease was spread intentionally, Indigenous people quite rightly thought and anticipated or expected that had been intentionally released. I'm not dismissing the idea that there could be more intentional releases. In fact, that's what we're studying. But that's one of the questions that really intrigues us and we want to get a better handle on.
That's a very good point. There's also some accounts of vaccine being withheld, especially in the Vancouver Island area, and people being sent away. And
that's the big 1862 epidemic, where
yes,
by that time Victoria was a major trade hub, and people from as far away as Haida Gwaii were coming down every year. And there's an outbreak of smallpox there by a ship that arrives from Sacramento carrying the disease, and the Indigenous people are told to leave the city, and that facilitates this massive spread of smallpox throughout British Columbia and more widely. There was another massive epidemic that started in Puget Sound in 1854. So this is a tragic period. And what intrigues me, one of the things that really intrigues me, is that it's the history of how Indigenous people's understanding of smallpox changes over time as they acquire more knowledge and more firsthand experience with the disease. Because as I say, a lot of these fur traders are threatening to release it. In at least one case, it is released intentionally. There's that tragic incident that you just referred to, where people were driven out of Victoria, and then that caused the disease to be spread. But in other cases, Indigenous people are only giving vaccines, but not the knowledge of how to create that vaccine, which is cowpox, and is actually something that you can create. If you have cattle, you can create your own vaccine. So they're holding back the medical knowledge, selectively giving the medical knowledge out and vaccines to certain people who are their allies, or who they see it as strategically important to ally with at that time. But they're not vaccinating everybody all the time, and they're certainly not sharing the knowledge on how to create vaccine or how vaccines work. Rather, they emphasize and reinforce the idea that the vaccine is some kind of magic that only the Europeans have access to, and that's a way of continuing to express power over the Indigenous peoples.
I'm seeing a lot of gratitude in the chat box, but
Oh,
I would just
wonderful,
like to
thank you.
welcome everyone in thanking Keith for sharing with us today. Really, we appreciate you and appreciate all the work that you're doing.